Doctors of Reddit. What happened when you diagnosed a COVID-19 denier with COVID-19? ICU, COVID ICU charge nurse here. Had a woman try leaving the ER against medical advice with COVID and was needing tons of O2. Our docs convinced her to get admitted. My wife was her ER nurse and brought her up to me. Patient was yelling and screaming, ripping off her mask, spitting and telling us we're all sheep between gasping for breath. Our docs told her she was close to needing to be intubated. Breathing tube. And she just scoffed. We reached out to the husband who proceeded to swear and berate us, telling us we're keeping her prisoner. No visitors in our COVID unit. And that we can do whatever we need because none of this is real and it's all for show so you guys can get paid. She gets intubated, decompensates over the next few days, and finally codes. We code, perform CPR, give medications, defibrillate, etc. her for well over 1.5 hours before calling her time of death. The kicker was calling her husband and getting absolutely excoriated because we injected her with COVID as an experiment and killed her. He then had to be escorted out of the hospital when he came in to try getting up to the unit without a mask. Of course. This shit's getting exhausting. They just kept denying they had it, stated they had something else, and tried to leave against medical advice while on high-flow nasal cannula, which we didn't let him do because he would have died within minutes before he was admitted to the hospital. He was symptomatic but refused to isolate at home. He gave it to his wife who ended up in the ICU. Didn't diagnose a denier. So not exactly this. But did have a patient refuse testing upon admission and aggressively yelling, COVID as a hoax. I calmly said, okay, nurse. Since we won't know his status, please admit him to the COVID floor. He became a believer in an instant and requested to be tested. I had a lady who was maxed out on high flow. Next step is breathing tube, who still refused she had COVID and was holding a negative test in her hand that she had taken a week prior. I'm a family doc who mostly does outpatient. I live in a pretty conservative area with a good proportion of COVID deniers. So I've been seeing COVID deniers since this mess became politicized. I've lost a few patients over the mask mandate. Anyway, I'm pretty pleased to say that several of my COVID-denying patients have completely turned their attitude around when they, or a close family member, contracted COVID, even if their case wasn't severe. The sudden terror that they could wind up on a ventilator overnight really puts the fear of God into people. Unfortunately, I still have some patients who are still pretty obnoxious despite their COVID diagnosis. They mostly dig in deeper into paranoia. If not about the virus itself, then about the circumstances surrounding them contracting it. If Fauci had done his job from the beginning, it never would have hit this town. It's the entire fault of Obamacare that I can't get the experimental immunoglobulin treatment. Quote, it's not. Your eligibility for the infusion is dependent on a list of risk factors. And probably my favorite. So I have COVID and it's completely your responsibility to fix it. I need you to send hydroxychloroquine, zinc, Vit D, lisinopril and azithromycin to the pharmacy. Then they proceed to get pissed at me when I don't. And yes, each of those things were actual things patients said to me after getting their diagnosis. I could probably think of more, but those were the most memorable ones. I'm an emergency department physician in the U.S. I work in an area that had the highest death rate for a solid couple weeks in the country. During our peak time when we had national news crews here covering how we were a shit show. Saw numerous people screaming their COVID disease wasn't real despite being hypoxic and on large amounts of oxygen due to COVID. That was an unpleasant time as this was still early. May, June. And it was extremely political, like people apparently plotting to kidnap our state governor due to lockdowns. Saw a lot of people refusing COVID testing who needed admission for non-COVID purposes because the swabs would give them COVID or put some sort of tracking device. They weren't pleased when they then had to be admitted to our full-blown COVID floors. Our COVID floors resembled a war zone because they were understaffed and relative shithole conditions, as we basically converted hallways into COVID floors. Also saw a lot of people, young people who weren't exactly deniers but thought you basically couldn't sick if you were young. Lots of people with their lungs permanently scarred, or at a minimum a couple weeks of misery, and or spread it to their loved ones who got extremely ill. Drill sergeants of Reddit. What was the funniest thing a recruit said? Fort Sill. OK 2002. During my basic. DS is smoking us on the first day. Playing, who doesn't want to be here? If you don't want to be here, I don't want you here. Just tell me and you can go home. We've been in front lean and rest for between 15 minutes to 2 years. Give or take. When somebody raises their hand. DS was flustered for a second because I don't think anyone had ever actually been dumb enough to raise their hand. He goes and gets gown in private's face and in screaming at him. Finally he says, "Why don't you want to be here?" I'll never forget the response. Drill sergeant. This is not what my recruiter led me to believe this would be like. Only time I saw the DS speechless. I ended up doing basic OCS and officer basic course with that guy. There was another Phil Ken Sebin in the platoon, and the DS asks my one day if I would mind if he called my white Phil Ken Sebin, so he could tell us apart. I'm white. DS and other guy weren't. I think he wanted to see how I would react. That weekend we got our phone call and I asked my parents to address my next letter to white Phil Ken Sebin. Next mail call. DS, who was really cool as DS's go, is just rattling off names and gets to my letter. You could almost hear his brain record scratch. Worth the push-ups. Recruit fired all his blank ammo during ambush response training. He crawled in ditch to opposite where the aggressors were and started throwing rocks at them. D came running in middle of the road blowing his whistle and screaming, "What the fuck are you doing?" Single quote. Recruit screamed back, throwing hand grenades drill sergeant. Without missing a beat. The D screamed, "Out fucking standing," and walked away. In Navy boot camp we have a thing before battle stations called Amnesty Night. This is where we confess all the dumb shit we managed to get away with to our RDCs and not get in trouble. Our chief had a lisp, which we all talked shit about throughout boot camp, but never in front of him. We had a pretty short guy named Patterson that could do a perfect impression of our chief. Patterson proceeded to stand up in the middle of forward IG and said, "Why the fuck do I have to keep touching your dirty ASTHSTH kivith? You motherfuckers make me saint hick." The intra-division was dying. The RDCs were in tears, about to fall out of their chairs. When everything quietened down, our chief looked at us and said, "I fucking hate you guys. But that was fucking funny." The entire division proceeded to die again. Edit. I can't spell. We had a strict rule to write official documents with a blue pen. It is a NATO standard and has its excuses, but all in all, it's one of those things. I had checked about 200 lines of weapons checkouts and ins when at the bottom of the page. It has 50 on one side of the page. There was one entry in black. As you would imagine, I found out who it was pretty quickly. Given the entry had his name and weapon number staring right at me. Now the military has this thing where you go through basic training for everything. I mean, if you were given a pair of speakers, You are mandated to read the safety and usage instructions and give a signature for it. So they can't be held liable to some degree. This absolute piece of twig and sap looks at me with the most uncanny look when I confronted him about it. After a bit of friendly banter in front of his whole room, I ask, "So what is your excuse for using black ink?" Sir, I've yet to get the formal safety and usage training for the blue pen. Sir. He rewrote all 100 entries in blue pen that evening after being the only soldier to get training to use a blue pen instead of a black one. But man, that was a special moment where all the muscles in my face were fighting not to laugh. Edit. Thanks to you. Add 1 CTED to games for asking about this. The reason he had to rewrite 100 is due to the system in place for keeping track of weapons and ammo. Can't say much, but there are certain ways to get info faster if you set it up in a certain way. But also because crossing out something was also a big no-no with weapons logs. So it screwed up our system to keep track of stuff and also made my commanding lose his brains when someone crossed something out. I'm not gonna get into the combination of black ink and crossing out with my CO. Asked a private the difference between cover and concealment. Private said, "Drill Sergeant, you asked what seems like a very important question which I am supposed to know the answer." However, this private was imagining not being called on, and was not paying attention to the question. Drill Sergeant. Not necessarily what a recruit said but had to do. Imagine this. 0500 in physical training formation. Everyone is dressed in the proper uniform. Gray shirt, blue shorts, white sock and a shiny new pair of New Balance dad shoes. Except for Recruit Dumbass. Recruit Dumbass realized he didn't have clean white socks while getting ready and thought it would be okay to join the formation in knee-high green socks. The following conversation transpired. Drill Sergeant. DS. Trainee Dumbass. What the hell do you have on? TD. Ma'am. I didn't have clean white socks so I used my uniform socks instead. DS. Trainee Dumbass. Do you know what covert ops is? TD. Yes. Ma'am. DS. Trainee Dumbass. I want you to covert ops your ass over to the barracks and acquire a pair of white socks from your laundry bag. TD. Asterisk stares blankly, asterisk. DS. Low crawl your ass to the barracks and get the correct pair of socks and your damn feet. TF. Asterisk does what he's told and low crawls nearly a mile to the barracks. Nearly dies from exhaustion and humiliation. Asterisk. Sincerely. Trainee Dumbass.
Subscribe, my brothers.